Her first words tore the future I'd paid for clean out of its box. "I'm not who you ordered," and the planks under my boots flexed as if the tracks themselves refused to carry the lie any farther. I was already rehearsing the first things I would say, the plain words I'd sanded smooth during a dozen nights alone, when the noon heat came down like a hand on the back of my neck, and the train shouldered into Dust Valley with a tired shriek that set every nail in the platform humming. I had made myself presentable in the way a man patches his roof before a storm. Not elegant, just sound, fresh shave that stung under the sun, hair tamed with cheap pomade, the blue cotton shirt bought on credit from Morrison because a new color across a man's shoulders can make him feel less like yesterday's mistakes. The ring box lived in my vest pocket the way a small stone lives in a shoe, constant, noticeable with every breath and shift, and I palmed it as if I could warm courage into the metal through skin alone. Pete, the conductor who'd hauled freight and miners longer than I'd been alive, tipped his cap and hollered that I'd picked a hot one to dress up, and I tried to grin back like a man not about to bet his whole life on a stranger's step. 3 people came down before her. Thomas Reynolds from the assay office with a soot-weary look, Martha Yates carrying a clutch of pamphlets that fluttered like frightened birds, and then the woman who stopped me cold because she fit and did not fit the picture I had built out of ink. She was younger than I expected, wearing a travel-worn gray dress that had been let out and taken in until the seams told their own story, dark hair pinned practical and tight, a carpetbag clutched in hands that knew work. She lifted her chin as if she could hold herself up by will alone, found my face, and gave me the sentence that knocked the wind out of everything I had planned. "I'm Clara. Evelyn was my sister." The name hit like the first dry crack of thunder before a dust storm, the kind that warns you there's more coming than you're ready for. My mouth offered the wrong reply, some cracked lip variation of welcome that tasted like old tin, and then all the heat in Dust Valley crowded under my collar at once, because this was not the woman who had written me spring when winter kept winning. The stop on our spur never lasted more than 15 minutes. It was a miner's errand, a cattleman's mercy, a schedule held together by habit and hope. And as the engineer's pocket watch clicked somewhere I could not see, the platform's shadow felt like a sundial measuring out a future I hadn't ordered either. She reached into a smaller bag and brought out an envelope whose edges had been softened by too much handling, and I recognized the hand that had crossed the distance between desert and city for half a year. Neat loops, careful restraint, a steadiness that had steadied me. For Luke Callahan, if I cannot deliver it myself, the front read, which was a cruelty and a kindness in the same breath. My pride stiffened its back and told me to refuse what I hadn't asked for, to send this woman back to whatever life had shaped that tight bun and those raw knuckles, because accepting a letter written in the past meant surrendering the future I had been counting in cattle and fence posts. My loneliness, older, smarter, less interested in appearances, opened my hand anyway. If I open this, my future changes, whether I want it to or not. The desert has a way of making a man feel the scale of himself. It stretches you thin between horizon and hunger until you hear how loud your own pulse can be when there's nothing else to drown it. And in that wide silence, I heard the arithmetic of a life collapse and reform around different numbers. I did not yet know the cause of Evelyn's absence, though the past tense in Clara's sentence had hung in the air like a cistern gone dry, and I did not yet know what sort of woman writes toward a deathbed with dignity, or what sort of sister continues a correspondence to spare a stranger a harsher truth. But I knew a promise when it stood trembling in front of me, and I felt the shameful, grateful relief of someone who has been waiting for happiness to arrive in a particular dress, and finds instead a human being. Dust Valley watched, because it always does. The saloon's laughter thinned, a pair of ranch hands pretended to check tack that didn't need checking, and Pete swung his lantern in a practiced arc that meant the window was narrowing. Clara's fingers shook when she offered the letter, but her eyes held mine with the level steadiness of someone who has been living on a knife edge long enough to learn how to bleed neatly. She said she should have telegraphed, said she hadn't known how to write what needed writing, said too many things a man doesn't deserve to hear from a stranger tasked with delivering the end of his favorite story. I told myself I could let the train carry her away and preserve the dream I'd been polishing, that I could ignore the truth written in Evelyn's neat strokes, that I could remain the version of Luke Callahan who still believed in neat resolutions and ordered arrivals. Then the whistle cut the air and called me a liar. Steam shouldered around us in damp waves, a white curtain across a stage that had never hosted a scene like this one, and the wheels gave their first determined nudge against the rails, a reminder that time is a physical thing when iron decides it is. The envelope weighed almost nothing. It was my hand that weighed too much, the same hand that had dug fence holes and pulled calves, now trembling because sentences written a continent away had more weight than cedar and sinew. I could feel the grit of the platform through the soles of my boots, the heat lifting off the planks in visible shimmers, the square edges of the ring box pressing into my ribs as if to ask whether commitment could be recalculated when the person it pointed to had stepped out of the world that morning, or last month, or in January, when I had still been writing her about sunsets. There was a moment, thin and bright and sickening, when I thought I might simply hand the envelope back and walk away, go mend a gate, salt a steer, do anything that kept me inside the old arithmetic. And then Clara flinched at the whistle like a skittish mare, and I saw how much courage it takes to keep a promise you never wanted to make. The carriage jolted as the engineer opened the throttle. Heat and steam gulped my next breath, and I broke into a run, caught the cold iron with my left hand, swung up beside her, and said through the racket of leaving, "Give me a day, just one day." Mercy begins as a bargain with your pride and ends as a debt to the truth, and I could feel both tightening like rawhide as the coach shuddered beneath our boots, and the valley slid backward in a glare of sun and steam. On the moving step, with wind pulling at hat brim and collar and the conductor cursing us both in a language made of gestures and decades, I pleaded for what felt like the smallest possible trespass on a stranger's grief, and yet the largest request I had ever made. Stay, let me read her words, then choose what you need to choose, and I will respect it even if it breaks whatever remains of me. I promised what a man in my county's registry could promise. Guest room on the second floor where my mother's quilt still kept the silence in order, Mrs. Chen from the boarding house to chaperone so Dust Valley wouldn't grind its teeth to nubs, my word that work would be the coin between us, and not pity. And as Pete yanked the air brake in a spray of grit and temper he was merciful enough to hide, the train ground itself back into stillness, long enough to let a different future climb down. Clara looked at the platform the way a person looks at a river they have to ford knowing the water is colder than they can stand, then nodded once like a soldier receiving orders she already intended to carry out, and said she would stay a single day on the condition that staying cost me nothing I could not afford, and her everything she could pay in labor. We climbed down under a sky that had decided to show off a cruelty of blue, and the town resumed its pretending, though I could feel it watching from the slits between batwing doors and the angled panes of the church hall like a jury that knew how every story ends. I felt their curiosity the way you feel grit in your teeth after a long ride, small, everywhere, impossible to spit out, and I carried it with the ring box and the envelope and the rasp of my own breath as we crossed to the livery where Cassie blew warm air across my knuckles and accepted the presence of a stranger with more grace than most people manage. When Clara set her palm to the mare's nose, Cassie sighed and mouthed the air like she'd found a pocket apple, and something in me took a step back from the edge. The ride home is not far, but on hot days it pretends to be a county wide. The alkali flats to the west throw back light like a mirror. The red rocks lean forward as if they want to hear your secrets. And the road, such as it is, offers a man the chance to think about every choice he's made since he could lift a bucket. We rode double because I hadn't the coin or the wits to arrange something more proper, and the minute I had stolen from the timetable, her skirt guarding modesty with a stubbornness I respected, our shoulders negotiating the smallest treaty of space that two people can sign without ink. I told her the roads' names, this dry wash, that turnoff, the stump that looks like a cattleman's pride cut down in a hard winter. And she answered with the kind of questions that prove listening is an art and not a performance. We did not talk about Evelyn. Silence did that for us, and did it better. At the ranch, I saw the place through her eyes and flinched at what I'd let go slack. The porch rail needing paint, the shutters holding on by will, the barn's door sagging on a hinge that had asked for help long enough ago to be embarrassed about it now. I waited for the small wince, the softening pity that makes a man wish he'd lied. But Clara scanned the spread the way I have seen good stockmen look at a string of horses, alert, unsentimental, measuring, and said, "Good bones," which is the only blessing any structure needs if someone is willing to swing a hammer for what comes next. Inside, the house smelled like the things a house should smell like if it has been scrubbed to the quick: lye soap, wood smoke, the faint ghost of my mother's bay rum that won't leave the stairs. And I found my mouth saying too many assurances at once in a rush to outrun shame. "The guest room is clean. There's a pitcher and basin. I will bring up fresh water. Supper can be late if you need rest." Clara heard the apology hiding in logistics and cut it in half with the simplest phrase a person can offer when they refuse to be the object of a story written by someone else. She would work for her keep. She said it without bravado, without the brittle defiance that can turn a virtue into a shield. Just a statement of terms that allowed both of us to stand upright in the same room. I agreed, because I would have agreed to almost anything honest in that moment, then added the one thing I had left that could make this arrangement bearable to the bones. No lies, not between us, not anymore. She nodded, and the house took that promise in like fresh air after months of shut windows. If this house is a test, I'm not sure either of us passes. Evening came down in layers, as it does when heat has had all day to bake the color out of the land, and the shadows stretched their legs across the yard until they reached the fence line and decided they were done. I hauled water from the well and listened to the rope rasp the wood, a sound I have known since boyhood that has never yet failed to tell me who I am. And then I set the bucket by the door and stood for a long breath, with Evelyn's letter in my hand. There is a violence in opening a dead woman's words that I hadn't understood until that second. Paper becomes skin, ink becomes pulse, and a man can feel like a thief at his own table. Clara's steps on the stairs were light, careful in a house that did not yet feel like it belonged to her feet, and I spoke through the door without turning, because I did not trust my face to be the kind she should have to look at. "Rest if you can. There's food when you're ready. Tomorrow we can see what the garden kept alive on its own stubbornness." The chair at the kitchen table had a wobble I had been meaning to fix for 3 years. I sat anyway and set the envelope down on wood scrubbed thin by hard seasons and better ones, then traced Evelyn's handwriting with a finger I did not recognize as mine. The lamplight turned the page the color of old cream, and the moths outside battered themselves against the window pane, as if there were wisdom inside they wanted in on, and the whole house leaned in to listen because sometimes a letter is not a letter but a gate, and sometimes a man is not a man but the hinge it swings on. I took a breath that found the bottom of my lungs and came back shivering. I closed my fingers around the envelope, slid my thumbnail beneath the brittle flap, and felt the room tilt as the seal gave way, certain that whatever rose from those pages was about to redraw the map of my life. I read her goodbye 3 times. Each time, it took something and gave something back. I broke the seal with a care that felt like prayer and spread the pages on the table where my mother once sorted seeds by the good lighting of late afternoon, and the first line steadied my shaking like a palm set to the muzzle of a frightened horse, because Evelyn came to me in the same precise hand she'd always used, except now the distance between sentences was crowded by the presence of endings, and she told me without apology that she had written not because certainty was hers to offer, but because hope was the only coin she had left to spend, and that when the cough drugged her edges and the morphine made time fold over on itself like linen, she asked Clara to carry the thread forward so the weave would not snap in my hands. She did not pretend the arrangement was noble, nor did she call it a grand romance that simply missed its train. She named it mercy, where mercy brushes against deception and both refuse to move, and in the paragraph where she begged me to forgive what she could not mend, I recognized the familiar ache of a person who has learned too late that the truth can be both a kindness and a wound, depending on whether the listener still has a future to bargain with. As the lamplight drew the ink up from the page like water from a well, I tried to portion my anger into neat piles, the way a rancher separates calves from cows, yet every heap slid back into the same shapeless drift, because whenever I reached for blame, my hand closed on air. The desert had taken Evelyn with the same indifference it shows a withered mesquite. The sickness had written its own schedule. The lies were told in service of a sweetness that had kept me alive on nights when the wind hammered the shutters and the coyotes built a choir from hunger, and the woman who had delivered the letter was standing upstairs in a house that did not yet offer her a single soft thing. Then, in a line that straightened my spine like a command, Evelyn made a plea that carried the shape of a blessing and the weight of a demand. Give Clara a chance. She will not take charity, only opportunity. And I felt something shift inside me, a tilting like the slow settling of a loaded wagon finding its balance after a rough patch of road, because I understood that what had begun as a correspondence between two lonely people had become a bridge, and bridges are only useful when someone is brave enough to walk across. I found Clara on the landing with her hands folded, as if she had been holding together a life that wanted to split into jagged parts, and I told her that I would not keep her longer than the smallest measure of fairness allowed, yet I could not let the day end without testing what the truth might build if given lumber and time. So I asked her to stay a week, not as a guest with debts measured in polite silences, and not as an accused seeking absolution, but as a worker who could exchange the currency of labor for shelter, and as a witness who could help me see the shapes inside the letter that grief makes difficult to read. She listened the way a field listens to the first rain after a drought, with no visible change, and yet a difference rising from its very surface. And she answered with terms that protected both of us from the laziness that pity invites, dignity at the center, honest tasks instead of hovering favors, no illusions about what we were or what we might never be, and a clear runway to leave if the ground beneath us stayed too cracked to plant. I nodded because there are agreements a man feels in his bones before his mouth can form the words, and then I made coffee I did not want and washed cups that were already clean, and I checked the latch on a door that had never failed, anything to keep from looking back at the pages waiting on the table like a physician's verdict. Upstairs, the floorboards whispered their small complaints under Clara's careful steps, and the house, which for months had sounded like wind in empty bottles, drew a longer breath and held it, as if two heartbeats under one roof had given the old timbers a reason to remember they were a home and not just a box wrapped in weather. When I returned to the letter, the second reading worked a different trade, removing the splinters of resentment my pride had planted and placing in their stead a sober gratitude that made my shoulders heavy in the good way. Because I saw more clearly that love built in ink is not false simply because it cannot drive a team or mend a fence, and that the hand which continued the script did so out of love that had nowhere else to go, a love that looked me in the eyes and asked to be recognized for what it accomplished rather than punished for the disguise it wore to reach my door. By the third reading, my anger had dissolved into the sad arithmetic of a life that did not add up, and yet managed to purchase moments of light, and I said out loud to the empty parlor that I would not spend another ounce of fury on a grave, because fury is a tool that fixes nothing the earth has already taken, and I carried the letter to the mantel where my parents' photograph kept company with a jar of spare nails and a tin of buttons, then stood looking at the three of them, the past, the hardware, and the plea, and understood that tomorrow could still be built with these materials, if my hands remembered how. I banked the fire and walked the stairs slowly, because on each riser a part of me was reconsidering the story I had been hauling like a busted gate, and at the top I paused where the hall widens to catch the light from the east window, and I told the dark that I would do my level best to replace resentment with work, because I do not know any other way to honor the dead than to take better care of the living they leave behind. I don't want a substitute, I want what's real, whatever that is. The night came in with a hush so complete it felt like a new kind of weather, and in that weather the house changed its breathing. Not louder but deeper, like a mule settling after a long day under the harness. And I lay down on a bed that had always seemed a size too large, and listened for the creaks that have named every hour since my boyhood, and found, between the familiar groans of timber and the far-off bark of a lonely coyote, the braided sounds of someone else's sleep slipping into the same structure, which should not have comforted me and yet did, because grief rarely arrives alone, and sometimes it brings the first outlines of a future that does not ask permission to begin. Dawn shouldered through the kitchen window with the pale assurance of a thing that has come to be reckoned with, and I set the cast iron on the flame and ground coffee with a steadiness I did not feel, telling myself that before the sun climbed past the porch beam, I would choose whether to rescue the garden from its slow surrender or bury it as proof I still knew how to let go. If I couldn't fix my heart, maybe I could fix the ground. Morning put its back into the light the way a team puts its shoulders into a heavy wagon, and I carried that same intent out to the patch of earth that had once been my mother's pride, and lately my quiet humiliation, where weeds had written their own scripture in every row, and the scarecrow leaned like a drunk who'd mistaken perseverance for posture. Clara stood beside me with her sleeves rolled and her skirt pinned out of the way in a manner that suggested she had long ago traded vanity for competence, and when I handed her a hoe she took it with the nonchalance of someone who has learned the language of tools so well she can speak it even when tired. So we moved together into the thicket of bindweed and amaranth and stubborn volunteer squash, cutting and prying and hauling in patient motions that rang through the handles into the bones of our forearms, until I remembered the kind of fatigue that makes a man feel honest again. The sun rose to its work without gentleness, and the dirt made its way under our nails as if it were planning to stay, and my palms raised blisters that popped and stung and told me I was alive in a register I had been avoiding, while Clara matched my pace without theatrics, her breath steady, her focus a straight line from problem to solution that asked for no compliments. And it was in the quiet between our steps and the scrape of steel that respect took root, shy at first like a seed that is not sure the frost is truly past, then bolder as the rows began to show their original shapes, because any two people can talk themselves into compatibility in a parlor, but only labor can determine whether their rhythms can be braided without chafing. We worked until the shade had fled, and the air itself seemed to be a weight we had to lift with every motion. And only then did I call for water, not because I wanted to stop, but because a man who forgets to rest becomes the kind of fool who mistakes collapse for grit. At the well, she untied her kerchief, and the mark it left on her forehead spoke more plainly than any speech about the life she had come from, and I poured for her first because there are rules no desert man breaks, and because I needed the seconds to make my question less clumsy. When she lowered the cup, I asked which words had been Evelyn's and which had been hers, and I tried to keep my voice in the key that acknowledges how answers can hurt even when they are the only medicine. And Clara, who could so easily have built herself a safer version of the story, told me the timeline of a mercy that had changed its handwriting out of necessity, that at first she took down the sentences exactly as a sister dreams them and fears them and bargains them. And later, when pain whittled thought to fragments and morphine scattered the order of things, she began to carry the weight of transitions, to finish the thoughts, to hold the thread, and then, after the end, when silence threatened to become the only correspondent, she kept writing to spare a stranger the humiliation of grief delivered by telegram. I listened to this simple, costly truth, and when the well's rope creaked, I heard the echo of the weeks when I had lived off those letters like a man stretching a sack of meal, and I told her there had been one that felt different, less like a dream and more like a door, and that it had arrived on a week when half my herd went sick, and I had learned the shape of failure by touch, and that the letter did not lie about hope so much as it offered a place to set it down for an hour so I could pick it up again with steadier hands. She nodded without triumph, as if the admission were not a medal, but a proof that the risk she took had landed somewhere useful, and when we went back to the rows, Our cadence changed in a way that is difficult to name without sounding like a hymn, because we were no longer two people rescuing a garden from neglect, but a pair of workers apprenticed to the land and to each other, learning where the other's strength was strongest and where the other's back began to bow, so that she took the fine work of teasing out roots that snap when rushed, and I put my weight behind the shovel where the soil had hardened into a reluctance that needed a man's boot at the top of the blade. The scarecrow watched us with its stitched smile and crooked hat, and I promised it silently that if this patch took, I would restuff its chest and set it straight, not because crows deserved the courtesy, but because a mended symbol can hold a fence line against despair. Sometimes the first thing to sprout is trust. By noon, the rows resembled something a ledger could respect, not perfect, but legible, and I could see in Clara's face that useful exhaustion, which means a person has spent their strength in a direction that returns more than it takes. So I suggested we eat, and she countered that food tastes better when the tools are oiled, and we compromised by sitting on the edge of the porch with plates balanced on our knees while I sharpened the hoe to a cleaner edge, the rhythm of the stone soothing the day into a tempo that let us talk about next steps without sounding like we were making demands. We spoke of compost and mulch, and which seeds respond to heat with vigor, and which sulk until the nights turn kind, of rows that welcome companions and rows that prefer their own company, of the well level, the wind's habits, the way dust travels along the ground like an animal with its own agenda. And as she gestured toward the patch with a fork and claimed this square for radishes and that for beans, I felt the layout of the work settle into me, the way a map becomes a person's second sight. When the plates were clean and the tools set to rights, I wiped the sweat from my brow with my sleeve and looked past the fence toward town, where gossip tills faster than any plow and where reputations sprout overnight like mushrooms after rain. And I understood that if this venture was to survive its first season, we would need to face the counters and the eyes and the false smiles sooner rather than later, because coins and supplies and starts and cuttings do not appear out of air, no matter how persuasive your hope may be. I told Clara as much, not as a warning, but as a declaration that partnership means dividing not only the labor under the sun, but also the weight of being seen, and she took it like a task rather than a threat, nodding in that practical way of hers that makes yes sound like a plan already half complete, then asked when we would ride and whether Dust Valley accepts proof quicker than it accepts promises. I said that Dust Valley believes what it can count and what it can taste, that it respects a straight back and a clean ledger, and a woman who doesn't flinch in a room arranged to make her flinch, and that if she was willing, we would buy what the soil needed and what the rumors would require. I stood, shouldered the shovel, and told her we'd ride at first light for Morrison's counter and Mrs. Chen's measured gaze, because if the garden was to live we had to feed both the ground and the town, and Clara, with dirt on her cheek like war paint, said she was ready to meet Dust Valley on equal terms. Dust Valley doesn't shake your hand until it has weighed your pockets, your posture, and the story you tell with your eyes, and the morning we rattled into town with a seed list and borrowed nerve, I felt the scale tip and creak before a single word was spoken. Morrison's bell gave its tired jangle as we stepped inside, and the old boards under our boots answered with their usual complaint, but it was the counterman's face that told me where the talk had settled since the train, curiosity edging into calculation, the kind of look a man gives a mule he's thinking of buying if it pulls straight, and he boomed my name as if he could anchor the room to a familiar post, while his gaze slid to Clara and took the measure of the quiet in her shoulders, the practical set of her hands, the way travel dust had made peace with her hem. I said we needed seeds and starts, and a few tools I'd neglected too long, then set her list down like a challenge, and watched his eyebrows ride up as if the page had suddenly grown taller. He read the columns: radishes and lettuce for speed, onions for certainty, pole and bush beans to climb and to fill, tomato starts from Henderson's greenhouse if she could be convinced, summer squash for the quick return and winter squash for the long game, herbs to perfume the room where coins change hands, and the air in the store changed from gossip to business, the shift as tangible as the weight of a good rope in a man's palm. "Quarter acre," Clara said. not apologizing for the ambition, and Morrison tapped the paper with a blunt finger, looked from her to me and back again, and decided out loud that if we put it in the ground properly, there were buyers tired of eating freighted softness and canned resignation, and that he would move what we grew, or, failing that, clear a table at Saturday market so the town could decide for itself whether freshness could carry a price. Mrs. Chen arrived with the efficiency of a woman who has spent a lifetime teaching rooms to behave, her dress dark and neat despite the heat, and she nodded at me with that brisk affection she saves for men who were boys under her roof at one time or another, then turned her attention to Clara with the frank appraisal of a midwife and a magistrate combined. She took Clara's hand, pressed it once, and offered in the same breath that made the offer proper, the safety of a spare room if the arrangement at my ranch needed distance, and a chaperone's eyes if the town required it, and a bowl of dumplings if the day refused to soften, all of it wrapped in the soft rules that make hard places livable. I watched Clara meet that gaze without shrinking or swelling, just a steady yes that had no need to prove itself, and the knot I'd been carrying between pride and worry loosened a turn because I could see the town locating her in its web, not as a scandal to be plucked for entertainment, but as a person with edges that would not collapse under staring. Sarah Mitchell floated over when the list had become a pile of packets and a slip with numbers that would make me eat beans twice a week. Her voice sugared, her eyes sharp, the sort of sweetness that scratches if you stand too close, and she let my name fall from her tongue like a thing that belonged to her once, and might again. If the wind changed, then let her gaze slide to Clara with a smile that said the line between welcome and warning is as thin as ribbon. She asked, as if idle talk were charity, whether I had finally decided to hire help I couldn't afford last year, and I said what needed saying where every ear in the store could claim it later without embellishment. That Clara Harper was my business partner, that we were expanding operations, that the counters people like to lean on would soon hold our greens and our honesty together, and I watched the word partner settle into the room, heavier than rumor and harder to move, and I watched Clara hear it, not as flattery or shield, but as a structure she could lean on while keeping both feet under her. We loaded the wagon in a heat that softened the edges of everything, and the road home offered the kind of silence a man can fill with either doubt or resolve. I chose the second because the first has never grown me a single blade of grass, and I told her again, as if repetition could nail it to the ribs of the day, that partnership meant equal stake and equal say, that her knowledge and my land would meet in the middle, or not at all, and that a ledger will forgive many sins but not dishonesty between the names at the top. She didn't flinch at the word or the weight, only asked about water and wind, and which patches baked first, and which stubbornly held chill until noon. And I answered because answering is the first kindness a place demands when you intend to ask it for a living. Back at the house, the list became packets in a drawer that smelled, faintly, of time from the old days, and the packets became rows marked by twine pulled tight as a line on a map, and the map became work that found the limits of our backs and asked for more. I brought out the ledger, the real one, not the one a man keeps in his head where pride fudges numbers, and I put it on the table between us and wrote equal venture in a hand, careful enough to be read a year from now without the translator of memory. We spoke the terms so even the walls could remember them if either of us forgot. 50 for the land and the well and the shelter, 50 for the plan and the labor and the know-how, expenses first, reserves next, then profits, according to what we both agreed the month had truly yielded, and when I slid the ledger toward her I felt the house decide that it could begin to trust us with its ghosts. The paper says partner, my chest says something I don't dare write down. We planted until the sun fell sullen behind the red stone and the light thinned to the color of old brass, our hands making small graves and tucking hope into them, with the care of people who have learned not to insult the future with careless wishes. I watered while she tamped, she labeled while I stretched the twine to its last knot, and when we finally straightened and looked at what we had done, the plot had ceased to be an indictment and become an argument we intended to win. Inside, she washed dirt from her hands in my mother's basin, and I stood at the door holding the empty seed envelopes like a man who had just spent the last of his coins at a table he believes isn't rigged, telling myself that risk is a more honorable hunger than regret, and that tomorrow would test whether the ground agreed. Sometime in the night the soil shifted and sighed under the moon as if swallowing a promise, and at first light, when the cool still held and the birds had not yet decided who owned the fence, I walked the rows and saw the soil lifted into the tiniest green tents that meant radish had punched through, and I felt that impossible tug in my chest. Too early to celebrate, far too late to pretend nothing had begun. Before the town could decide what to name us, we practiced moving together in a room whose floor knew every argument my family ever had. And if there is a way to learn a person faster than by waltzing across scars and knife marks, I have yet to find it. The rows answered our faith with punctual manners. First, the radishes shouldering the crust with their emerald epaulets, then the lettuce whispering into frilled lines that promised to cool a miner's tongue on market day, and I learned to read the garden from the porch, the way a man reads a herd on a ridge, by the posture of things, by the way light exposes laziness and rewards care. And each morning we took our coffee with the beans counting upward and the onions sharpening their breath, and the rhythm that had eluded my days since my father's last winter returned as if it had only stepped outside to smoke. The work laid down rails for us. I checked cattle at first light and brought in water while she turned the top inch and teased out weeds with that decisive wrist flick that says, "You have earned your efficiency," and by late morning we were shoulder to shoulder in the rows, not speaking because the need to speak had been spent elsewhere. And in the afternoons she took the ledgers while I mended the fence where a winter wind had taught the posts a bad slouch. There is a sound the cast iron makes when it receives heat that feels like a promise, and we lived in that sound. Coffee at dawn, cornbread in the evening, the skillet breathing its even breath while we tallied expenses against expectation. And the hours spread themselves into something like a life without asking for permission slips from the past. When Mrs. Chen stopped by with a jar of pickled greens and a glance that could set an unruly room straight, she found us both, not as actor and observer, but as two hands on the same job, and she nodded in that way that says a witness has satisfied her own standards and can now be relied upon if anyone else needs convincing. The church social loomed like a weather front, the kind that makes men look at their roofs and women count what's in the pantry, and I knew we'd be watched from hat brim to heel by people eager to see whether scandal would outpace sobriety, so I pushed the kitchen table against the wall until the long ruts in the floor told me where my mother used to push it, and I said I'd make a fool of myself now so I could make less of one later, and Clara smiled with the wary bravery of a person stepping onto a river rock slick with moss, then placed her hand in mine and waited for me to find the count. The waltz is older than the lies people tell about it, and its charity is that it lets the leader own his mistakes while the follower makes those mistakes look like choices, which is one reason men devote more credit to themselves than the music allows. I stepped forward, she stepped back. We drifted a hair wide and then too close. My boot scuffed her toe and she hissed a laugh through her teeth that saved my pride from bolting. And for a minute we were not a man with a dead woman's letter in his pocket and a stranger brave enough to deliver it. We were just two bodies solving a moving problem together under the stern gaze of a frying pan hung like a judge. I do not know where breath goes when concentration takes it. Only that when it returns the world looks changed, and somewhere between the third turn and the wide circle, we tried to trace past the stove. The room narrowed to the sound of our feet and the warm pull of her palm where it rested against my shoulder. I nearly forgot the count, she corrected with a pressure of fingers that communicated a paragraph of instruction without the indignity of language, and our steps found a timbre that matched the garden's new pulse. Patient, aligned, not without error, but error forgiven and folded into the intention of the next measure. When we stopped, the quiet rang like a struck glass, and in the pause that followed I felt the weight of all the unasked questions hook their claws in my chest. And yet I did not move, because moving would have declared a verdict I wasn't ready to carry down the stairs to the porch where the night would surely overhear. If I cross the room now, nothing will be the same. We both heard it, the sentence that didn't reach the air, and we both obeyed it like a law written before either of us was born. She stepped away with care that honored the risk we had taken. I busied my hands with the foolishness of straightening a table that didn't need it, and we pretended to consider whether the lamp should be turned down or doused entirely, when what we were really considering was whether to let the night finish what the dance had started. In that performance of ordinary life, there was a dignity that kept us from tipping into the easy mistake of asking our loneliness to make decisions on our behalf, and I was grateful for the restraint even as part of me hated it, because restraint is a tool a man uses to keep from breaking what he hopes to build. Later, in our separate rooms, the house resumed its habit of commentary. Old joists answering the cool with cracks and sighs, coyotes writing their thin epistles to the moon, the pump creaking once like a dream trying to remember the taste of water. And I lay awake counting not sheep, but choices, which is a more exhausting arithmetic, and I thought of the social and its lanterns and the way the town would lean forward to see if our steps would hold under public scrutiny, and I considered for the first time without flinching the possibility that people could call us what they liked if we kept calling each other by our right names. When morning burned off the last of our hesitations, I saddled Cassie and found Clara on the porch with her hair already pinned and her eyes bright with a steadiness that made me stand taller, and we stepped off the boards into the hot light with our shoulders squared to the same breeze, having agreed without flourish to meet the town in its own circle and let our feet prove what our mouths were not yet ready to say. A room full of lanterns can be darker than a mine if the wrong eyes are watching. The church hall had been dressed to look generous. Paper garlands scalloped from hymnals that had given up their second lives, bunting so sun-faded it remembered other summers, lanterns set in disciplined rows across the rafters so their warmth might persuade strangers to like each other. But the moment we stepped inside, I could feel the cold arithmetic of attention begin, that quiet counting people do when they're measuring whether a story will pay out more as gossip than as grace. I offered my arm to Clara because a man ought, but also because the floorboards knew my name and I needed the steadiness of another pulse beside mine. And when the fiddle squared its shoulders and the accordion found the 3 count, we stepped out where the light was brightest and did the thing we had rehearsed in a kitchen that remembered every mistake I'd ever made. Our waltz felt steadier than our nerves deserved. I met her eyes on the turn. She pressed a fraction of intention through her palm to correct me before I drifted, and the hall adjusted its breathing to our measure, the way a pasture quiets when the herd moves right. Martha Yates sailed in with her teacher's energy and an armful of approval, and before either of us could catch our breath, she had positioned us at the edge of the floor where the traffic of opinion runs thickest, turning to each cluster with a schoolroom voice that made our work sound less like a rumor and more like a syllabus the town had been waiting to enroll in. She asked what we were planting and did not wait for my answer. She asked how quickly lettuce can turn itself into coin. If you respect its impatience, she asked whether Mrs. Henderson's tomatoes would hold shape on the wagon, and, having asked, announced that the library table would be needing herbs on Thursdays, and that the school children would eat better if I would stop pretending this was a hobby and admit it was a business. Orders gathered like a storm on the horizon. Jacob Miller wondering if we could spare enough tomatoes for his wife's canning kettles, the Reynolds family begging dill for pickles that might bully winter into tasting like summer, the pastor's wife requesting green onions because her soup had grown tired of salt. I watched Clara receive each request with the calm of someone who has already sorted the week ahead in her head and merely needs the ledger to confirm the math. Sarah Mitchell arrived the way sugar shows up in bad coffee, too late to fix what's bitter, eager to be noticed doing it. She smiled at me with the practiced fondness of someone who likes to hold a man in the past where she prefers him, then turned that same mouth on Clara as if generosity were a garment she could loan for the evening and take back in the morning with a remark about a missing button. She asked whether I'd hired help at last, her tone making help sound like a flaw I would eventually confess to. And I felt the heat rise in my collar, not from shame, but from the old impulse to minimize, to dodge, to avoid making a scene in a room built for worship and potlucks. Instead, I did what the partnership demanded. I stepped half a pace sideways, so the room had to look at us together and said, at a volume meant for the curious and the hungry both, that Clara Harper is my business partner, Said it cleanly so the word wouldn't wobble. Said it in the hearing of Mrs. Chen and Martha and Morrison and the blacksmith's twins and every mouth that would carry it home like a fresh loaf. The word landed with weight. Sarah's smile thinned until it became an edge she could cut herself on if she wasn't careful, and Clara met that edge with a plain, unornamented gaze that did not blink. We danced once more because a second proof convinces those who distrust first impressions, then let ourselves be dragged to the refreshment table where lemonade sweated into mismatched glasses, and the cookies had the lopsided confidence of children sent into the world with too much nutmeg. I watched the crowd pivot around us, felt the angle of its attention change. What had walked in as speculation was walking out as inventory, and what had been whispered as scandal was being revised into the much duller and more durable language of commerce. How many rows? How soon? How much per bunch? Will you take script, or must it be coin? Mrs. Chen drifted close, adjusted the set of Clara's cuff with the intimacy of community, and murmured a sentence so small I nearly missed it. You are being seen correctly, which is the sort of blessing you do not clap for, but carry home like a talisman. Respectability is a performance. Truth is what survives backstage. By the time the third reel had twisted the room into a friendly tangle of elbows and apologies, I could feel our names tiring on other people's tongues, which is the first signal a wise man heeds when he doesn't wish the night to turn his story into its plaything. I caught Clara's eye, and the look that passed between us said what language would only bruise, so we made our farewells with backs straight and smiles that did not threaten anyone's sleep, and stepped into a night so clean it felt new-laid. The rumor mill rattled behind us like a loose wheel on a wagon we did not own, and the breeze off the flats combed the heat from our hair as we walked to the hitching rail. On the ride home, I told her what had been speaking in my bones since Martha turned our seed list into a civic event, that we would sell with our own hands to the town that had just measured us, that we would skip the respectable cut that a counter demands, and stake our name where people can count the dirt under our nails and the snap in our lettuce with the same eye. She studied the moon-bleached road as if it were a ledger, and nodded once, a signature delivered to the night. We planned the market debut before the gate latch clicked. No middleman, no apology, our table marked with our name. And I felt the week bend toward Saturday like a bow pulled tight. By noon, the baskets were empty, and for once my pockets weren't. Before sunrise, I was out in the yard stacking the crates I had hammered together from salvage, boards that had framed a stall once and would now frame our argument with the town, while Clara gathered the harvest with that methodical grace of hers that makes efficiency look like devotion. Radishes came first, fat and brazen, their frilled greens bragging in the lantern light. Then lettuce, cool as river talk. Then the first of the green onions that still carried a whisper of soil at the roots, which I refused to wash away completely because people should be allowed to taste where food begins. She tied bundles with twine, hands quick and precise, and I loaded them into the wagon with the care you give a thing that can make you or break you with equal willingness. We had a sign I'd burned with a nail heated in the stove: Callahan and Harper Produce. Crooked enough to be honest and bold enough to be legible across the square. The market wasn't much, a rectangle of dust bordered by intentions, a handful of tables selling eggs that had survived children's hands, quilts stitched through long winters, a crock or two of butter sweating under damp cloth, and the kind of chatter that keeps a place believing in itself even when the math refuses to. We set our table at the edge where the breeze had a habit of wandering, and the shade from the false front fell just so, then stood behind it with the awkward pride of new parents, ready to be told our child had the good sense to look like both of us. The first half hour was all eyebrows and slow circuits, people pretending to consider while their noses did the deciding, and then Martha arrived with 3 school children in tow, bought 2 bunches of radishes at full price, and sent the children scurrying across the square with crimson slices balanced on their tongues like proof. After that, the line became a fact. Coins rang the tin in that bright way only coins can. No paper sigh, no murmured promise. And I ruled columns in my head to calm the thrum in my chest, while Clara made change with the muscle memory of a woman who has had to account for every penny since the day childhood ended. Jacob Miller took a sack of lettuce and asked whether we'd have tomatoes by Sunday. The mine foreman, who had looked at us sideways at the social, bought 3 bunches of onions and muttered something about soup. Morrison himself ambled over from behind his counter and told me I'd placed the table well before buying radishes at retail, which I took as both a welcome and a warning. By noon, our crates were empty, our sign looked more official for the smears of juice it wore, and I found my pockets weighted in a way that did not make me ashamed. We took our triumph where triumph is best seasoned, with Mrs. Chen's dumplings, at a table in the boarding-house kitchen that had seen more secrets than the church pews ever would, and she brought tea without asking and asked questions without prying. And Clara answered with plans that felt like weather forecasts delivered by a woman who knew how to read the sky. More rows, staggered planting, a second succession for lettuce before the worst of the heat. Experiments with herbs that could convince miners they were rich for the length of a stew. I ate until the hunger in my chest quieted, and the hunger in my head woke up, and then we walked home under a sun that had earned its swagger. On the porch, I brought the ledger out like a relic, and set it between us while the day unbuttoned itself into evening. We counted the coins twice because the first tally felt like a miracle, and miracles deserve verification. Subtracted the seed and twine and table wood, reserved what prudence demanded for what the week ahead would certainly ask, and found to our shared and sober amazement that what remained after responsibility had eaten was enough to move the horizon a step. Clara drew a small rectangle on the page where the margins met and labeled it Greenhouse Fund in a hand that did not wobble, and then she sketched in the air. Here a frame to catch winter sun. Here a place for seedlings to learn the language of light before the wind tries to teach them something rougher. Here benches where a woman can work in January without a knife in her lungs. I watched the future make room for itself at my table, and felt the ache of having carried the past alone begin to loosen its teeth. "I'll say a thing and hope it doesn't spook either of us," I told her. And when she nodded, I set it on the porch between our boots where it could not be mistaken for a trick. The house feels like a home again. Not because a woman has moved through its rooms, not because the ledger has finally stopped accusing me, but because work has started making sense here the way it used to when my parents handled a day as if it were a tool, and because your handwriting in that book makes the numbers behave. She didn't run from the sentence. She let it stand and looked at it until it settled, then spoke in that careful cadence we've developed for truths that could go brittle if touched wrong, saying that belonging is a crop like any other and should be planted deliberately. If she stays through winter, the word for us will have to change. The light on the red rocks deepened to that sorcery that makes stone look like a thought God forgot to keep to himself, and I was reaching for the page to add up once more, because the small pleasure of columns is one of the few vices I can afford, when the quiet shattered into hoofbeats that had no patience for fences or propriety. A rider came hard up the yard, his mount blowing, his hat in his fist the way a man holds it when bad news has outrun him and he wishes to arrive at the same time as his courage. Dust salted his face, his shirt was ripped at the shoulder, and he didn't dismount so much as spill to the ground and grab the porch rail like an old friend. "Cave in at the mine," he panted, eyes raw with the information he'd been forced to carry. "Men trapped. They need every hand that can hold a shovel and every back that'll fit a brace." I was moving before the last word quit his mouth. Ledger shut, rope for Cassie found, gloves grabbed on the run, because some calls don't ask, they command, and Dust Valley had just issued one in the only voice it trusts. Dust is light until it's a mountain on your chest. The boy came hard out of the heat with his hat in his fist, and his fear already spoken in the way his horse's sides heaved, and before his mouth made the words, I felt the shape of them in my ribs, the blunt blow of disaster that travels faster than language. Henderson's youngest was trapped, he said, and another man, a newcomer whose name he didn't catch in the scramble, was deeper still where the dark breathes a different air. And there was no politeness in the way the news took the yard. It simply reached for the first thing that would move. And that thing was me. So I was in the barn with Cassie, already knowing the bridle by touch, the rope coil finding my forearm like a remembered habit, the gloves that still smelled faintly of bay rum from my mother's scrubbing shoved into a pocket because seconds were a currency I could not spend on ceremony. I told Clara what I had to tell her, in the few words a woman deserves when a man is called to a place where timbers fail and decisions get made with shovels. That I would go and that I would be careful and that this was work the valley asked of every back it trusted, and she nodded with that practical steadiness I was beginning to count as part of the ranch's water supply, then set her jaw and divided the day without asking whether she was allowed, half of it for the ranch that would not wait, and the other half for gathering what men need when rock turns mean: bandages and biscuits, coffee boiled strong enough to lift a beam, blankets to blunt the chill that comes for the saved as quickly as for the lost. The mine had the look of a camp that has been reminded of the terms it always knew: men moving with the careful fury of those who understand how quickly courage can become rubble, women laying out their arsenals of care on planks that had been dinner tables an hour earlier, children pressed into service as runners with messages that could not afford to be wrong. The foreman's face had the chalk of dust and the chalk of decisions no man wants, and when he said the name Henderson, I saw the distance between a rancher's grief and a mine owner's ledger collapse into the same thin breath. We went in early in the push, Jacob Miller and I and two others working like a four-handed machine, bracing where the mountain muttered, hauling where the mountain allowed, the air inside already sticky with the taste of iron and oil and fear, the lantern's breath small against a dark that has forgotten how to be persuaded by light. When we reached the pocket where the Henderson boy's voice had been counted and answered, he was there under a slope of splintered framing and sullen stone, conscious but with that glassy look that says a person is doing arithmetic against pain and not always winning. So we shored and lifted and slid and cussed in the old useful language that keeps a body upright, and when the boy was free and heaved toward daylight in arms that could not yet believe their good fortune, the tunnel behind us exhaled in a way that made every spine bow and every jaw clamp, a reminder that we were guests in a throat that could close without apology. Back at the mouth, the foreman weighed his duty in front of 100 eyes and found the safer line. Calling a halt in the close way, a man says a thing he hopes will be enough. No more digging. Too unstable, too great a chance we'd bring the rest of the hill into the wrong century, and people groaned or cursed or simply went slack with the fatigue of being told to stop when stopping means abandoning a voice they had all heard. I stood with my hands on my knees pretending to breathe like a calm man while inside my lungs a small animal tore at the bars, and I could hear him, the newcomer, somewhere beyond the timberline that now looked more like a boundary than a rescue, calling soft, not the shout that begs, but the sound a man makes when he knows big noises will bring the ceiling down. I do not own eloquence, so I gave the foreman the only sentence I had that felt like it belonged to me. There is a living voice in that tunnel, and I will not leave it under a mountain. And Jacob, who has sons of his own, and the arms of a blacksmith and a calm I have envied since boyhood, looked from me to the mouth and back and said he would go if I would accept that smart comes first, and brave comes second, and that if the roof called the meeting over, we would run like men who have not yet used up their share of luck. We went in paired to our fear, lanterns held low to read the grain of failure in the shattered braces, a sack of wedges and a handful of nails in my belt, Jacob with a short-handled sledge and the rope wound across his chest like a vow, and every sound magnified into instruction. The hairline whisper of settling, the brittle cough of a splinter deciding it would rather be dust, the hollow knock that tells a man he has one heartbeat to change his mind. We spoke in the arithmetic of labor, 1, 2, 3 on the lift, set the cribbing at my foot, pass me the brace, ease now, easy, listen, hold, breathe, again. And in that shared counting, the dark gave us the shape of a man wedged in among rocks that had not yet made up their mind whether to crush him or let him go. His name, when he could finally spit it clear, was Patrick, and I'll remember the way it sounded in that throaty half-light as long as I remember the smell of my father's hatband, because it was a name said by a person who believed there were still ears for it. We pinned the ceiling with the last of our lumber, slid him onto the board we had rigged a lifetime earlier that afternoon, backed away in inches because inches were the only honest currency down there, And when the hill consented to let us pass, we moved like thieves under a sleeping giant, paying rent in sweat and prayers neither of us would quote in daylight. The cheer at the mouth was not a cheer for men. It was a cheer for breath, a roar that washed the mud from my knees better than water. And hands took Patrick from us the way a congregation takes a baby, passing him into care without arguments about doctrine. My own hands trembled like a green colt, not just from the work, but from the late arrival of the fear you delay when moving is the only version of courage you can afford, and I would have made a fool of myself reaching for the nearest post if the nearest post had not been Clara, who came at me with that terrible gentleness reserved for souls who have been carried out of the dark and need a moment to believe the light isn't a trick. And, when she wrapped her arms around me without asking permission, I felt the world decide to keep me a little longer. I'm fine, until she lets go. I could feel the eyes of half the town measure the distance between propriety and gratitude, and find propriety too small for what had just been exchanged. And I did not care, because some truths must be said with bodies when words would buckle under the weight. Mrs. Chen was there a breath later with clean cloth, and Martha checked my scraped palms with the brisk tenderness that can shame a man into breathing correctly, and somewhere beyond the ring of care, I heard the foreman's voice again, not issuing orders now but making a different kind of announcement, that a town meeting would be called at the church tomorrow, and that the owner from Silver Creek would need explaining to, because perhaps the mine should be shuttered, perhaps the numbers had tipped beyond salvage, perhaps the safety could not be bought at a price a ledger would honor. The cheer turned into the low talk that makes the future nervous, and I looked at Clara and then past her to the black cut in the hillside and knew I would have to go stand in a different kind of dark and argue for something no lamp could light. Word went out before the last lanterns cooled. Church at noon, figures on a board, livelihoods on a line, and an owner with a pen deciding whether a town deserved another season. I'm no orator. I just refused to bury a man alive. The church smelled of damp wood and old starch, and the particular anxiety of Sundays that have forgotten they were meant for rest. And when I took my place on a pew not far from the aisle where my mother once marched me by the ear for some boyhood rudeness, I could feel two tides working at each other. The tide of numbers gathering their cold cases on a slate at the front where the foreman had chalked columns of costs and risks and wages, and the tide of faces swelling with the complicated heat of people whose meals and mortgages and reasons to wake were braided to a shaft in the ground that had just reminded them it is older than math. Jacobson, the owner from Silver Creek, had the pale look of a man who has slept badly in a good bed, the look that says he had seen all this from a distance, and now wishes he could return to that distance without being called a coward. He cleared his throat and let the foreman do most of the saying, that the shoring would cost this much, that timber prices were stubborn, that the angle of repose is not a metaphor, that a closure would be temporary in theory and permanent in practice, that men could move on, and so could their hunger if they had wagons and the will. When they had finished arranging despair into neat columns, the room held its breath the way a pasture does when the wind shifts, and even the birds decide to listen. And I stood because my body asked me to before my pride could remind it that speeches belong to men with better tailoring. I said what I had, which was not eloquence or policy or scripture that would satisfy a banker, but the memory of a voice in a tunnel and the refusal to let that voice end in a graph. I said that this land had never promised kindness, but had offered terms. And those terms were simple. Do not expect softness. Do not ask the sky to rain when your hands are empty. Do not give up on each other when it would be cheaper to do so. And that yesterday I had obeyed those terms with a shovel and a length of rope, and today I was asking the man with the pen to obey them with a ledger, which is just another kind of rope if you hold it right. I told him the truth that sits grinning on the porch of every enterprise in Dust Valley, that we cannot keep men safe without spending money, but that money will not stay in a place that closes its own doors, and that the only arithmetic I trust begins with breath, because a town that quits on breath has forfeited the right to lecture its children about grit. I did not flatter Jacobson with stories of philanthropy or name him savior for work that should be ordinary. I asked him to price the braces and the bolts and the timbers with the same seriousness he would give his own roof if the first winter storm found the weak spot, and I promised him, because it was mine to promise, that if he would meet us at the brace with his coin, we would meet him with backs that did not quit, and shifts that did not whine, and a gratitude that would not rot into entitlement, because people who have hauled a man out of the earth do not forget how heavy a favor is. I looked at the slate, and then at the pews, and then at Jacobson, and I said that numbers say close when they forget to count the things that cannot be carried in a pocket, and that faces say, stay, because faces have to, because faces have children and mortgages and a stubbornness that is sometimes wisdom and sometimes only stubbornness, and that perhaps wisdom today was to spend so that tomorrow we would not be buying train tickets out of town. Something changed that did not make a sound. Perhaps it was only the way men shifted their weight, or the way the sunlight through the high windows made a chalk line on Jacobson's sleeve, or the way Mrs. Chen's hand closed over Clara's like a signature. But the owner lifted his eyes from the slate and looked like a person who had remembered he too possessed a chest, and not just a vest pocket. He said he would not promise what he could not yet price, and I found that honesty more respectable than a cheap pledge. He said he would telegraph for estimates, and he said he would come back with figures that could be argued with, and he said, in a voice that tried not to notice it had grown rough, that the photograph of people cheering at a shaft mouth made a poor advertisement for shutting down the shaft those same people had risked their lives to keep part of their story. The relief that moved through the room was not the kind that leaves clapping in its wake. It was the kind that makes shoulders lower a half-inch and spines lengthen enough to carry another week, and when the meeting turned back to committees and collections and the dull miracle of logistics, I sat down beside Clara and felt the wooden pew accept our combined weight, as if to say the building itself had opinions about our partnership. On the walk home we let the road do most of the talking, and where it could not find the words we used the few we trust, that I had not said what I most wanted to say, because I am still learning to tell the truth without demanding an answer immediately, and that she had stood in that room beside Mrs. Chen, not as a shield, but as a neighbor, and that the town had seen us as the thing we had declared ourselves to be, and would keep testing that declaration until the first frost and beyond. We did not celebrate because victory would have been a lie. Instead, we planned as if planning were prayer, and we took the ledger to the porch and placed our fingers on the blank space we had labeled Greenhouse Fund, and we agreed out loud that waiting for permission is the most expensive delay a small operation can indulge, and that winter will not grant an extension simply because summer made us feel important, and that if we wanted year-round income and steadier meals, and the dignity of offering lettuce in January to people whose dented cans have been arguing for years that January doesn't welcome green, then we would begin the work now while the night still remembered how to be cool. We can't force investors to love us, but we can invest in ourselves. So we green-lit the greenhouse in the way poor people do, which is to say with conviction first and cash second, and I promised lumber and she promised designs, and we both promised to forgive the other if mistakes arrived dressed as initiative, and when the sun slid behind the red rocks with that old theatricality I have never stopped admiring, I felt in my pocket the accidental weight of the church bulletin folded around a note I hadn't known I'd caught. It was from the postmaster, one line scrawled crooked with the speed of a man burying a favor inside routine, that a letter had been logged eastbound to west, Philadelphia the origin, our valley the destination, and that I could collect when the stage changed horses tomorrow afternoon. Somewhere between river air and alkali dust, a Philadelphia envelope was already carrying its postmark toward our porch, and I did not yet know whether it brought closure or kindling. Some vows begin in work clothes. We did not begin with rings so much as with an inventory, the kind you make after a long season when the ledger has spoken and you're brave enough to listen. Sitting shoulder to shoulder at the pine table while the heat pressed against the shutters and the scent of soil followed us inside, agreeing aloud to the terms that would turn partnership into permanence without mortgaging the honesty that had brought us this far. I told her the only proposal I trusted was the one that could survive chores, that I would not ask for a future until we had both named the boundaries that would protect it. That equality was the first hinge and respect the second, and she set her palm on the open ledger like a witness and said she would not trade her dignity for security, nor allow either of us to slip into the old laziness where one person's affection becomes the other's excuse. And we signed the day with a look that made space for conditions and protected the tenderness we hadn't yet named. The Philadelphia letter arrived as if summoned by our caution, a small envelope with the stiff posture of legal news that had traveled a continent and lost none of its nerve. Inside was a tidy paragraph in a clerk's hand about Clara's aunt's shop, sold at last, debts paid, a remainder that would not make anyone rich, but could make choices louder than fear. Choice money, not escape money, and we held it between us like a bright coin at the bottom of a well, deciding with a single nod that some of it would become glass and timber in a winter garden, and some of it would sit quiet in a jar neither of us would raid unless a future with a child required it. Not a dowry, she said. Chin up in that way I've come to know means she is defending something worth defending. An investment we'll steward together. And I could see, clear as the starlight on the water trough, that a woman who has counted pennies until her fingers ache understands the holiness of a fund set aside for a life not yet arrived. We walked to the church to tell the Reverend what we intended before we told the town, because some bridges are best crossed with a quiet witness and a date on the calendar. There were no theatrics, no choir summoned from oblivion to pretend this was the first marriage the valley had seen, only Mrs. Chen reading in the pew from her own book of proprieties, nodding when our list of conditions matched her list of hopes, and Martha smuggling in ribbon and advice and an offer to pin Clara's hair that did not sound like she thought my hands were clumsy, though they are. I bought a ring in Silver Creek without sentimentality or apology, a plain band that would not shame a woman who cooks with both hands and weeds by the fistful, and I did not pretend it carried a magic the vows would not also have to carry, because metal is only a promise until you put your back under it. The ceremony, when it came, fit the building and the weather, short, sincere, witnessed by more faces than I expected, and fewer than rumor had prepared me for, and when we said what we had written, no poetry borrowed from men who made things too sweet to swallow, just workmen's words about honesty, patience, and choosing the same person on days that are not special. I felt the timbers above us settle the smallest fraction, as if the church itself approved of our thrift. The ring slid onto her finger and felt like what a ring ought to feel like in a place that respects simple tools, useful, beautiful enough if you're close, an emblem that won't catch on fence wire. And the paper the Reverend handed us afterward had less ink than a bill of sale, and more meaning than a deed. Before we reached that door with all its eyes and congratulations, though, we had finished the intimate business a week earlier at the table where most of our truths have been traded. We wrote our names together on the ledger of the heart, which is to say we took the partnership column and extended it into a column called home, and we agreed on the clauses that make a house safe for two people who have learned hard lessons in different cities, equal say on purchases that cost more than a week's profit, equal ownership of mistakes, and the courage to name them before the other has to, the right to call a halt when exhaustion turns tenderness into carelessness, and a standing promise to leave our pride on the porch if an argument tries to make itself bigger than the marriage. When she smiled and held out her hand to seal it, I saw not a concession, but a colleague, not rescue, but reciprocity. And that recognition did more to steady my knees than any sermon ever has. After we were legal, we were tender, and after we were tender, we were ordinary in the best way, which is to say we folded ourselves into the routines that make a life. Fence checks at dawn and coffee that smells like the day promising to behave, notes on seed succession tucked into the margin of a grocery list, a clean shirt laid on the chair because she knows I forget, and a mended cuff because I know she won't ask. Friends came by with pies that wobbled and jokes that didn't, and Dust Valley, which measures everything, weighed us and decided to call the thing by its right name. Mrs. Chen kissed Clara's cheek and whispered a sentence that floated like a blessing across the room. Husband and wife are words that grow deeper with use. And when the door finally shut, the house exhaled in relief at being plural. I carried a letter west. Now I carry his name, she said later, not grandly, just as a fact on her tongue that rearranged the furniture in my chest with a single touch. I answered the only way I know how, by working on the greenhouse sketch until the nails on the page found their places, and the winter sun had a path into our hunger. We set the inheritance to work. The first purchases aimed at glass and framing lumber, and a door that wouldn't argue with January. The rest preserved in a tin we labeled for the future we hadn't dared to say out loud, the one that would turn us into a unit greater than two and require a different kind of courage. The days that followed our vows were not glamorous. They were the good kind of repetitive, the way breathing is repetitive, and the quiet yes we had given each other kept proving itself in the small places. My hand reaching, automatically for hers on the porch step, hers closing the ledger with a satisfied nod when the numbers matched the honest story of the week, both of us laughing in the kitchen when the waltz we used to practice in secret turned up in the way we moved around each other with a skillet and a towel between us. I carried a letter west. Now I carry his name. What I did not say at the altar, but say now to the night when it leans close enough to hear, is that some vows begin in work clothes and remain most beautiful when they return to them. That the romance I had once imagined would arrive on a train in silk turned out to be a woman in a gray dress with good bones and a stubborn will, and that the most sacred part of our promise is the way we keep showing up for the same life even when it forgets to clap. We are not a story people will write songs about. We are a pair of hands that have learned each other's maps, and that is a kind of holiness no choir can outsing. Late winter scratched its knuckles on the window. Dawn found her at the stove with a hand pressed absently to her middle, and when I turned from the coffee mill, she smiled a new, fragile smile, and said the sentence that taught me a fresh pronunciation of joy. Morning sickness has been keeping me honest, Luke. We're expecting. On the hottest night of August, the desert finally kept a promise. By the time the greenhouse frame shouldered up against the sky like a ribcage ready to protect what mattered, our quiet undertaking had become the beginning of a pattern other people could follow. Letters from neighboring ranches asked for our notes on rotations and our stubbornness about soil, and we sent back recipes for resilience written in pencil and proofed by blister. The Hendersons hammered a cold frame against the south wall of their kitchen. The Millers tilled a stubborn patch behind the forge that had been hoarding nails and thistles for a decade, and Old Man Reynolds, who had always claimed vegetables were for rabbits and weak constitutions, began to trade us mining script for onions, as if he had invented the transaction. In town, the mine that had stolen our sleep returned to work under new timbers paid for by Jacobson after figures from Silver Creek came back with enough truth in them to make a cautious man brave, and the whistle that had sounded like a threat in spring found a way to sound like a schedule by early summer. Clara's pregnancy made tenderness and caution into daily chores, the way sweeping and feeding have always been, and I learned the line between protecting and patronizing by stepping over it once too often and being called back gently but firmly to the right side. She set the boundaries with that unblinking practicality I love. She would not lift what the midwife prohibited. She would accept help on the heavy work before pride had a chance to make a mess of sense, and she would continue to run the books and the planting chart because the mind does not become fragile simply because the body is busy building a person. I replaced fence posts with more attention than they deserved, oiled the hinges that had been asking me for kindness for years, and read aloud in the evenings from seed catalogs and the kind of novels that let a woman laugh between bouts of nausea, which struck her like small storms, and passed with the relief of a sky finally remembering how to be blue. We timed succession plantings against the calendar the baby made with her kicks, learned the language of cravings and aversions the way we had learned the weather, and somewhere between the second lettuce flush and the first tomatoes blushing on the vine, the house shifted its center of gravity. Rooms that had held only our work began to hold anticipation, and Mrs. Chen appeared more often with reasons that pretended to be practical and were really love in an apron. I measured my days by cattle out of habit, and then, slowly, by the rhythm of Clara's breath at night, and the thump of a heel against her palm when the baby announced displeasure at how long we were taking to fall asleep. I used to measure days by cattle. Now I measure them by breaths in a cradle. She labored through a night that felt like a year lived in one room, Mrs. Chen commanding like a general who has seen all the battles and won most of them, Martha assisting with a competence that made me forgive all the times she'd assigned me double reading as a boy, and I learned the hard lesson all men learn on that night, which is how to stand nearby and be useful without pretending sovereignty over what doesn't belong to you. When the first light pooled like mercy on the floorboards, our daughter took her place in the world with a cry that sounded like fierce agreement, and I saw Clara's face relax into that exhausted holiness a man never deserves, and sometimes earns a glimpse of. We named her Evelyn Harper Callahan, because the past that brought us here had to be honored, and the future she would carry needed room in the syllables, and when I said the name aloud, the room seemed to memorize it. I wore the locket I had given Clara the first quiet Christmas we shared, 2 tiny photographs inside, one of her and her sister taken before a city finished bruising them, one of us under the church rafters saying the words we had written ourselves, and when she fastened it round her neck again, the chain lay against skin that had done its great work, and I thought of how letters began this life, and how breath now sustains it, and I promised aloud to both women named Evelyn that their courage would not be squandered on my lazy days. The greenhouse glass arrived on a wagon 2 weeks later, late because glass behaves like a difficult child in desert heat, and I installed each pane with the care of a man who knows he is building shelter for more than seedlings. Inside, benches waited for February's ambition, thermometers hung like quiet overseers, and I wrote our principles on a scrap I tacked above the door. Choices, courage, community, the doctrine we intended to teach our daughter with our days and not our speeches. We spoke that doctrine to her at the wash basin where we counted fingers and toes and thanked whatever mercy counts such things, on the porch where the wind brought us red dust and gossip in equal measure, at the market table where coins rang their fierce little songs and strangers turned into neighbors across radishes bright as lanterns. We told her that bravery often looks like showing up again tomorrow with your tools and your apology, that love sounds like laughter in a kitchen and partnership, like 2 people disagreeing without meanness, that community means you take your turn in the shaft and your turn at the refreshment table, and that none of this has to be glamorous to be holy. The weeks slipped into a new shape, naps braided into watering schedules, feed time adjusted to the fierce schedule of a small stomach, the ledger now titled Household as well as Ranch, because milk and cloth have their own columns. And in the middle of that practical rapture, I found quiet pleasures I had never thought to look for. The way a baby's breath cools your shirt through the cotton, the way a wife asleep with her hand on a crib will sometimes smile for reasons that do not require your understanding, the way a man's anxieties shrink to manageable beasts when he is given tasks with names like burp and rock and walk. I was not good at any of it in the beginning, but I was willing. And in Dust Valley, willingness is the nearest synonym for skill that anyone who matters respects. We were, for the length of a harvest and the soft stretch of early autumn, exactly what I had dared to want. Married, solvent enough to build without begging, rooted in a town that had moved us from its curiosity column to its ledger of dependables, guardians of a child whose lungs could out-argue the coyotes on a good night. And then, because the story of this place refuses to be satisfied with a single kind of weather, a courier rode up in the glare of afternoon with a leather satchel and the expression of a man who carries a message he did not write and does not enjoy delivering. He handed me a packet thick enough to be trouble, thin enough to be urgent, and tipped his hat with a sympathy I had not yet earned. Inside were legal papers from the Silver Creek Company laying out a water rights claim that reached like a slow hand toward our well. If they succeeded, the greenhouse would become a glass monument to grief, and the garden a memory people would be cruel enough to call naive. I looked from the sleeping baby to the parched horizon and said the only sentence that made sense as the desert drew a new line in the sand. Dust Valley hasn't met the worst of us yet.